95% of all organizations across all industries are pursuing some kind of biosolution. And 72% of the people surveyed expected biotech to accelerate their sustainability goals.
Hey, Karl, how's it going?
It's going great. There's been some really good news in biotech that you highlighted. Why don't we get into that?
Yeah, absolutely. So a lot of our friends that were on the podcast or will soon be on the podcast, hopefully, have some great announcements. So for our longtime listeners, you might know Joe Landolina of Cresalon. And Cresalon is a company that has created a product for wound care. So if there's a bad accident and there's a lot of bleeding, they had created a product that was used in pet care. So they had a very interesting strategy in creating this product in the veterinary world, which has less red tape. But as of a few days ago, Cresalon received FDA approval for their Vetagel, which is now called Traumagel, to be used in humans. And that's so exciting. Their strategy is working. They're able to help people that need emergency or military grade medical care. You can think about soldiers in the battlefield. They get shot and they need to control their bleeding. They would use Cresalon's gel in order to stop the bleeding. And it's so great to see our friends, companies progressing and really making a huge impact on society. So congratulations to Joe Landolina and the team at Cresalon for their FDA approval.
Yeah, and isn't it, if I remember correctly, they have the biggest biomanufacturing facility here in Brooklyn, right?
Yeah. I mean, I'm not sure if it's the biggest, probably, because Brooklyn doesn't have a lot of biomanufacturing facilities, although Pfizer started in Brooklyn back in the day. They are a darling of Brooklyn Biotech, the team of Cresalon and Joe. So it's just great. It seems like family.
Yeah, so you mentioned Pfizer starting in Brooklyn, and I actually just drove by the Pfizer building in South Williamsburg. It used to be the Pfizer building. I think now that building has a lot of catering and food companies in it. I know there's also some fashion companies that are in there. I visited probably like 5 or 6 years ago, but drove by it and thought about Pfizer's long history in the borough of Brooklyn. You also had Living Inc., who has not been on the podcast on our list of news. What was interesting about that news? We've known Scott Fulbright of Living Inc. for a long time.
Yeah. So Scott posted on LinkedIn that they have a partnership with New Balance, the shoe company, New Balance. So Living Ink is a company creating an ink using microbial technology. So I believe they're using, is it algae, Karl? Do you recall?
I think so. Yeah, I think it's an algae-based ink.
Yeah, and they're creating black ink, which is incredible. So New Balance selected Living Ink as a global supplier of sustainable ink used for their hand tags. So New Balance, not only do they have shoes, but they have clothing as well. And on the clothing, there's a tag to tell you the price and the size. And the tags are usually black with New Balance logo written in white. So that black on the tag is going to be the sustainable ink created by Living Inks. It's again great to see our friends in our network. We have not had Scott Fulbright on the pod yet. Work your magic, Karl, work your charm, get him on the pod. It'd be so great to speak to him about this new development. But to see the companies that we talk to working with big brands is incredible, because those are just signals that the bigger economy is going towards biology, and it's fantastic.
Yeah, and I think we've mentioned this before on the podcast, but black is a very tough color. We love our black clothes in the city, but it's the most difficult color to use as a dye because it washes out very easily. Mm-hmm. And you have to dye clothes at a higher temperature for the dye to stick to the fabric. And historically, the way black dyes have been made are not very environmentally friendly. So we're very excited for Living Ink and their progress. So yeah, Scott Fulbright, we need to get you on the pod, and we look forward to having a conversation with you. So congratulations on the New Balance deal. You seem to be making some really good progress.
Yep. And then a final news story that we have, a friend of the pod, Melik Demirel of Tandem Repeat, just posted that they have achieved 100 kg pilot production for their protein fibers. So for our listeners, a reminder that Tandem Repeat is a biomaterials company, and they have looked to the biology of squid teeth. So they looked at the biology and they mimicked the biology of squid proteins to be regenerative, to be self-healing, to have all the hallmarks of a wonderful, highly functioning, high-performing fabric. And to be able to see Tandem repeat scale up is incredible. And another signal for the large companies out there that, hey, look, biomaterials can scale up. I don't know how much Tandem Repeat's charging, but I know that Malik will post his episode in the show notes. He is getting their materials to be low cost, at cost parity, because everyone in the biomaterials industry knows that that is part of the plan, that they need to get to that so that the bigger brands can find their products not only attractive and usable, but affordable and works with their economics. So another great news, another great example to share today on our new episode.
So you may have noticed that Erum mentioned 3 examples. Each example showed how biotech is being rapidly adopted by bigger companies and how costs are being driven down. So today on this episode, what we're going to do is talk about biostrategy and why it's important for all companies as we make a transition from fossil fuel dependency to regenerative biosolutions or solutions that are circular in nature. So today it's a conversation between Erum and I. There's going to be a lot of notes attached to this episode. Is there anything else we should say before we get into it, Erum?
No, let's get into it. It's going to be very exciting. So listen up.
Let's go.
Hey, Karl.
What's going on, Erum?
Yeah, we've been really busy. You've been speaking to a lot of consumer companies. What's been going on? What have you been learning?
We're trying to understand more about how they are thinking about biotechnology as a tool for sustainability.
Mm, mm,
We know that biotech solves all or many of the problems that companies are having, and big consumer products companies, there's 12 companies that everybody buys everything from. So it would make sense that these companies are adopting or looking at biotech as not only an innovation tool, but also to drive sustainability.
yeah. But isn't that expensive, Karl? Isn't that the biggest problem that a lot of companies are like, okay, yeah, I definitely want to leverage biology, but it's expensive and consumers aren't going to pay for more expensive products.
We have had people on the podcast talking about how to drive down costs. So if we think back to our interview with Edward of Synonym, building out the biomanufacturing infrastructure, we just had the interview with Michelle of Cauldron, also talking about building hyper-fermentation facilities. And they're not the only ones. There's several other people who are talking about this. So they're working to drive down the cost of biomanufacturing. And I think there's different angles to this, which we can talk about. But what we do know is consumers are driving demand for sustainable solutions. So there is a virtuous cycle in terms of consumers demanding more sustainable products and hopefully companies listening to consumers to start making their products more sustainably. There was a report that just came out a couple months ago that said 80% of consumers are somewhat concerned about the environmental impact of the products they buy. So that number, 80%, is up from 68% in 2023 and 66% in 2022. We'll put the link to that in the show notes. And I think, yes, things are expensive now and people are concerned because the economy hasn't been that great. It's been a little bit rocky, but people will push companies for sustainability, and companies need to find their ways to being more sustainable in their manufacturing and packaging practices.
Yeah, Karl, but I would definitely want environmentally friendly products, but maybe I'm not willing to pay 40% more for that product. Where's the silver lining here? So yes, 80% of consumers are concerned about the environmental impact of products, but when it comes to the checkout line, they're not buying more environmentally friendly products because they're more expensive. Also, on the episode, when we were interviewing Edward, he did say, yes, 60%, or I think at the time, I don't know what report he read, but he said 60% of consumers, I think that was a report from 2 years ago, that they want more environmentally friendly products, but only 3% are actually buying those environmentally friendly products. How can these big, huge companies, these CPG companies, think about biology, think about these solutions, get the costs down or relatively close, and start making that transition? What are you hearing from these companies that you've been speaking with?
There's two sides to this.
Mhm.
One side is they're looking for innovative solutions, ingredients that offer functionality that don't exist in the marketplace. We talk a lot about K18 hair. K18 hair is a good example of this. It's a premium product. It demonstrated that consumers were willing to pay more for a product that has novel functionality and is produced sustainably with biotechnology. So K18 is very big on their sustainability story. And I think it's a really good example. I think the other end of it is companies that are looking to replace existing ingredients with ingredients that are produced through biology at a cost that is comparable or competitive. There might be people who are willing to pay a premium for those products, but it's really not going to be widely adopted until both consumers demand more sustainable products and companies are making more of these products at cost parity to existing products. And the way that they get there is through biostrategy.
That's a great point, Karl. You've been looking at this for several years. Sorry, I don't want to say make it sound like this is
Forever.
ancient forever since you were a
You're
tiny
so
baby.
old, yeah.
No, but you wrote the book on it, right? What's your biostrategy? And I think this is a good way to introduce this to our audience. What is biostrategy? What does it mean? What are you talking about when you're using that term?
When we talk about biostrategy, what we mean is a framework to incorporate biology into a business's mission, visions, and goals. We know that big companies, all companies have strategies, which are really a goal that you're trying to achieve. What we talk about with biostrategy is having that goal incorporate biology into the company. But really what we're talking about here today is using biology to produce novel solutions, increase sustainability, and create ingredients that are more biologically friendly.
Yeah, that's amazing. I mean, of course, I like to sing that song as well. That's why I'm here with you. But one of the things that would be helpful to frame this is what are the risks of not biologizing? What if these companies were to do business as usual, don't rock the boat too much because they're making tons of money? Yay, they're incentivized. But how would they be incentivized to biologize?
Let's just look at one aspect of this. We talk about sustainability, we talk about circularity, but I think one thing we talk about fairly regularly is securing supply chains or localizing supply chains. Up until the pandemic, we were very used to shipping things all over the world, ingredients that you would maybe produce in a place where they are more inexpensive to produce, and then you ship them here. I remember a story about a company catching fish in the North Atlantic, shipping those fish to China to have those fish be produced into a product and then shipping them back. And that kind of thing is unsustainable. It takes a lot to move the fish from one place to another. You're talking about putting them onto a plane. That's a lot of fuel. And that was just one company, but companies around the world looking to drive down the cost of their products have created these supply chains that are very, very complex. And what has happened post-pandemic, most companies are diversifying their supplier base. And something like 71%, and we'll put the link in the show notes, 71% are actively investing in regionalizing and localizing their supply chains. I saw a map just very recently of P&G supply chain, Procter & Gamble supply chain, and it's actually surprising how much of the products that they produce are done in North America for the North American market. I think one of the risks of not biologizing is missing the opportunity to localize production. Another thing that you miss out on when it comes to not biologizing or having a biostrategy is innovation. If you don't have a biostrategy and you're not paying attention to what people in our world, in the biotech world, are doing, you're going to miss out on products or ingredients that are biologically friendly and a lot more friendly to the environment. What do you think the risks are of not biologizing, Erum?
Yeah, I mean, I think you hit on the major points. Personally, I'm fascinated with the new novel functionality that comes with leveraging biology. I think if people were to see side by side a product that was made in a traditional way and it works as business as usual or just works as they expected, and then a new product came along that just blew them away because it just does that thing and another thing and another thing, they would be willing to pay 30% more. Now, the question is, did it cost 30% more to make? Could it cost 30% less to make? Because if you can spend less money to make something better, then of course, I think a lot of these large companies would be all about it if that's the case. That's the driver for business. How do you get the costs down and how do you make more money? Is that producing more product? Is it increasing pricing, getting into new markets? Okay, that's great. But that's what's really exciting to me as a consumer, as a business person, which I'm not running any of these CPG companies. I'm sure that's why I do enjoy speaking with these companies when we meet with them, is understand what is really driving them. And they're all so very different because even though they're making competitive products, how they operate is very different. So some are being driven by sustainable practices, like those companies that have a huge European presence, because that's just the way the economy and the government work. They are just very gung-ho about banning certain types of chemicals. I think last time I heard there was like 5,000 chemicals banned in Europe, but like only 5 or 6 in the United States. So that's something to put in your hat. Like, okay, where are you actually innovating? But of course, when it comes to these big companies, it's about scaling up. So localizing is one thing. Can you scale locally? But how are you scaling? Do you need to create a whole new infrastructure, or can you use existing infrastructure and maybe it needs to be tweaked a little bit? So what are your thoughts on the challenges of scaling and any regulatory hurdles that are faced? And we can focus on the US for now because it changes country by country.
It's really important to pay attention to what's going on in Europe because they do drive regulatory. The laws that they have are much stricter, and many companies want to have products that are the same around the world. So you'll want to create products that will conform to those European regulations to ensure that they can enter any other market if those are the strictest rules. One of the big challenges is scaling, being able to scale. Let's put the regulations aside for a second. That's why I think we've had this focus on biomanufacturing companies. Like I said, we've talked to Synonym, we've talked to Cauldron, but we also have a lot of other companies that we pay attention to. Pow Bio, Liberation Labs, Manus, who we've been trying to get on the podcast. Manus has a big facility down in Georgia where they're producing a sweetener using biological processes, but they're also open to innovating with other companies on bioproduction. Then the US government has its BioMade private-public partnership ongoing, which we'd love to get them on the podcast as well, so that people understand that the government is also getting involved in this. And just by way of background, in February, again, I'll put the link in the notes so that people understand I'm not just giving these numbers out of nowhere. More than $220 billion has been invested in US manufacturing. We are undergoing a manufacturing renaissance in the United States. It's been a long time coming. And this has been thanks to the Inflation Reduction Act, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Bill, and the CHIP and Science Act. So all of those are contributing to increased manufacturing across the United States. And biomanufacturing is a part of that. In many cases, being able to produce a product at a large scale will benefit from those efforts and from having more facilities in place. And that will increase product consistency. That'll drive down costs. It should decrease the cost of feedstocks. We've got a bunch of companies that we're talking to that are using waste as a resource, which is fascinating. That, I think, will all drive those costs down.
Yeah. It does sound like a lot of the spend on infrastructure is going towards computer electronics and semiconductors. And I think that's because there is a demand for that, right? Whether it's phones or computers or EVs, other types of computer technology. Curious to know how much is being spent on biomanufacturing and including food, beverage, biochemicals, if they're being made through biological process. I think that's something we need to keep an eye on when it comes to how much money is the government spending on biomanufacturing versus the other types of manufacturing.
Yeah, you mentioned electronics. We should maybe do a deeper dive in terms of what it means for manufacturing. It is not just electronics has been a big part of that spend. I mean, this big facility, it's going into Arizona, which will bring, I think, something like 100,000 jobs to Arizona for chip manufacturing. But we also have a chip manufacturing facility upstate New York. I think there's actually a new one that's either going into Rochester or Syracuse. And those are just on the chip side. But then there's people who are building windmills. The big car makers have all invested in new facilities. SpaceX has been building out a humongous manufacturing facility down in Texas. So there is across the board manufacturing, but I think actually you're absolutely right, Erum. We should really investigate how much of that money has gone to biomanufacturing and what does that really mean?
Yeah. There's still several challenges when it comes to biomanufacturing. And again, we have people in the pod that we're talking to who are addressing some of these challenges. But when it comes to scale, and the concerns are for some of these CPG companies, is getting a consistent product. Can you guarantee that with fermentation? Perhaps with Michelle Stansfield of Cauldron, they have continuous fermentation. She talked about genetic shifts. So being able to address that and ensuring that there's a consistent product that performs as well as other batches, I think that's going to be really interesting to see. But at the same time, I'm like, as long as it performs the same, is it okay? I think that's one of the big challenges because a consistent product when it comes to biology relies on the feedstocks that it gets. So is it always going to be corn? Or maybe it's waste, which isn't consistent. So how does that work? Is it the engineering of the microbes that are used in the fermentation process? We went to this biomanufacturing webinar hosted by Synonym that had many different organizations partake in it. And Synonym talked about the report they did with BCG, where they said that 36% of a bioprocess optimization happens on the strain engineering side. That's really interesting because what we also talk about, and we can get into later, is what does labeling look like when it comes to biofermentation, fermenting products, because those are engineered microbes, but the product itself might not be engineered because it's coming from an organism that's engineered, but the product itself isn't. It's such a nascent field, but it's so exciting to look at. We are at the beginning of a huge transition.
Yeah.
And it's a lot of fun to see. But what are your thoughts about some of the challenges of biomanufacturing? What can be done to unlock some of the scale based on, like, say I'm the CEO of Pepsi and you're trying to convince me that bioprocessing is the way to go. And I'm like, oh, I heard that it was very challenging. What would you say to me?
Let's start small. Let's find the places where you're challenged in your supply chain. Let's look out at your supply chain for the next 5 years. And where are some places that you know that a product is not going to be available? And then let's find what the biological alternative is, or what is the biomanufactured alternative, even if it's not being produced at scale today. Because we know that if you, CEO of Pepsi, are being challenged by this, other people in your space are going to be challenged by it too. So if we can find the solution today and we can test it in our products, even at a small scale, then that would be something to invest in for the longer term. What does that investment look like? I don't know. It could be a special purpose vehicle where you and 10 other big companies come together to make sure that this product is produced sustainably, maybe with waste as a feedstock. I think that's the way I would approach it. You have to start thinking about the problem that you want to solve and finding the solution for it. So that's one way for sure.
That's perfect. You're hired. Congratulations. How do I work with you? Where do I sign?
Yeah. Let's step back for a second and then we'll come back to big CPG again. I just wondered, do you remember, Erum, during the pandemic, during the beginning of the pandemic back in 2020, where there were these toilet paper shortages?
I do remember. And I was like, wow, we need to start getting more people to use bidets. Anyway, that was kind of crazy. The havoc, like just all the toilet paper had gone off the shelves and just like, oh man, how do we solve this?
Right. And I don't remember, and I wish one of our listeners would tell us, was it because people started hoarding or was there actual a shortage on the production side? I don't remember. And I think we should look into it. You lived it. I lived it too. So now let's just imagine what the reaction would be if your bread shelf was suddenly empty.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. I mean, I feel like some countries, especially those that are in conflict and some political conflict, do experience this. It's unfortunate. Yeah, can imagine. I do try to eat less carbs, so I think it would be a good thing. But I can't imagine. I'm sure there'd be protests on the streets. Who would come and start making bread? I mean, I feel like there'd be a lot of local producers. People in the pandemic really got into making focaccia or sourdough. Yeah. So maybe there'd be some local companies that would be spinning up. But what are your thoughts here?
Yeah, the reason I bring up bread is because bread from big manufacturers tends to use palm oil. And we've talked about palm oil in the past.
Hi, a quick shout out to our sponsor, Messaging Lab, the force multiplier for biotech. Your biotech company is making the world a better place. You know that, we know that. But does the world? There's a big reason why some biotech companies attract investors, sign up customers, and get attention. That reason is strategic communications. At Messaging Lab, we translate complex science and economics into compelling narratives. And we have done that for the most successful biotech companies across healthcare, agriculture, personal care and beauty, materials, and the list goes on. We're here to make sure your ideas not only get heard, but resonate with your audience. So if it's time to amplify your company's voice, visit messaginglab.com to explore how we can elevate your story and grow your business.
Back in 2022, so at the tail end of the pandemic, Indonesia banned the export of palm oil because they're one of the world's largest producers, Indonesia and Malaysia. And they banned the export of palm oil because there was a shortage, and they wanted to make sure that internally they had the palm oil they needed for their own products. And so that was, going back to the beginning of this conversation, a demonstration of why people have really started to look at localizing their supply chains. We talk a lot about palm oil because we had Shara Tiku of C16 Biosciences on this podcast pretty early on, and they produce a palm oil substitute, and they're moving it into the food space. So it's exciting to think the big CPG companies that use palm oil in their bread will no longer be dependent on this supply from Indonesia or Malaysia or other countries that have been decimating their rainforests to produce this oil. But the question there is, are we going to move fast enough, especially in the face of climate change? And if there were ever other bans like this, would companies be prepared? And I think having that biostrategy in place and thinking about biotech as the solution to a lot of these problems is going to be key.
Yeah, having the whole supply chain on standby and making those relationships in advance. So we talked about C16 being a palm oil provider, but there's others coming online that we know. Schmieder is also getting into the palm oil game. And being able to have those conversations and say, hey, look, if this happens again, how prepared are you, C16? How prepared are you, Schmieder, to be able to produce this quantity of palm oil for our needs? And maybe it's not exactly palm oil, which I think C16 saying they're making an alternative that has very similar functionality, but the whole organization would have to be aligned with that strategy so they know how to change the labels of the products because it's not palm oil anymore. It's something else. So What would they say? Every single part of the whole product processing and marketing has to be ready. So it's not even saying do it today. It's saying be prepared as a plan B if something goes down. Of course, we would love it to be plan A. And maybe through the exercise, they start seeing, you know what, why don't we just do this now? Why are we just going to wait for something to happen? Let's be proactive and do it now. Maybe imparts new flavors that are more palatable, more, and I hate to say this, but addictive. Maybe it's more like, ooh, this actually tastes very, very good.
These Doritos are more addictive than usual.
Yeah, exactly. Like what's going on here?
It's scary.
Yeah, it's the new alternative from C16. That's, again, it gets back to my excitement for biology to impart novel functionality, novel flavors, textures, everything. There's so much that can be done. I feel like there's a whole opportunity that's not being captured by looking more deeply into biology for food, for cosmetics. And I think that's something we can get into soon is just what are the examples of how large companies are starting to adopt biosolutions and why they are doing that, who are the players, so that our listeners can understand and look at them as beacons. Look at how they're going to market, look at maybe how they're failing at some things and why they're failing so that they can understand if they're going to join the industry or even if they're going to make purchasing decisions, that they're more knowledgeable and they know who to trust. We do have lots of examples from people we had on the podcast.
Yeah, I mean, there are some good signs. We mentioned a Capgemini report at the beginning of this podcast, and I'll mention this new report that just came out a couple of weeks ago According to the report, 95% of all organizations across all industries are pursuing some kind of biosolution. And 72% of the people surveyed expected biotech to accelerate their sustainability goals. So that's exactly what we talked about at the beginning. One thing that was interesting about that sustainability goal number is that, unfortunately, less than half of the engineered biology / synthetic biology startups don't really know how to quantify their sustainability benefits, which is something that they can get better at. So, hey, if you're a biotech company that doesn't know how to talk about your sustainability benefits, call us because we want to talk to you about it. But I thought that those numbers in that report are very positive in general. And what we're seeing is that companies and the people who've interviewed and the people who we want to interview on this podcast are helping to make this transition, to drive down costs and to move these things forward a little bit faster. Erum, do you want to talk about some of the applications that people maybe don't understand have happened in the consumer products goods space?
Yeah. So as you mentioned, and as we keep hitting on this podcast, and the name of the podcast is that we can grow everything. And biology is influencing every single industry. So we said 95% of all companies are experimenting or using biosolutions. And so let's talk about a few of them. One of them that I'm very excited about, because I have some friends that are working at some big brands, Nike, REI, and they're looking for a replacement for nylon. So textile industry, not good for the environment. Nylon, it is a petroleum-based product. And the company Geno, formerly known as Genomatica, they shortened the name, they've developed a plant-based nylon intermediate using an engineered microorganism. So very exciting for them. And they've been working with companies like Lululemon to make sportswear. Again, a lot of big brands in that industry. So Nike, REI makes sportswear. They are looking for nylon alternatives. Patagonia, I mean, these are organizations that are very mission driven and they are hungry for solutions and they are willing to pay the price for premium bio-based nylon, and the consumers would be willing to pay for that too. So it is a great mission aligned transition that it will check off all the boxes. They're not necessarily looking for the cheapest price. They're calling it a plant-based nylon intermediate. So I don't know if it's just going to be that pure textile or maybe it's a mix, but hey, look, let's start somewhere. It's not a pure bio-based end product like a shirt or stretchy pants, tights or leggings. We all call it something different. It's a mix. It's okay. Let's get there. So I think in the material space, there's lots of examples. And again, we've had a lot of the leaders in the industry, in the biomaterials industry on the podcast, like our friends at Polybion, at Keo Labs, at Tomtex. They're talking about how they're working with the textile, the fashion industry, and it's exciting. So I definitely recommend listening to those episodes. What examples do you have of big CPG companies using bio-based solutions?
I have several, but I'll just use one that we all use every day, which is soap and detergents. Detergents have changed a lot. I don't know if people realize this, but we used to always have to wash our clothes in hot water. Cold water was something you didn't really use a lot of. I can't say this accurately. I want to say most detergents that you buy to do laundry work very effectively in cold water. And the reason for that is they have cold water enzymes that are produced via fermentation. And those enzymes are produced by really big companies like Novozymes, DuPont, BASF. And initially, those enzymes are found in cold water microorganisms in soils that live where the temperature is colder. And then they were subsequently engineered to be more effective. So thank you, biology, for giving us the gift of enzymes that work very effectively in cold water. And that's a big win for the environment.
Another environmentally friendly surfactant collaboration happened between Unilever and LanzaTech. LanzaTech, we're huge fans of, recommend listening to that episode we had with Zara Summers, who's the chief science officer at LanzaTech. But the partnership between LanzaTech and Unilever was to create the first dishwashing liquid and laundry capsule that's made via gas fermentation. Because LanzaTech uses engineered microbes to capture and convert industrial carbon emissions to ethanol for surfactant production rather than using fossil fuel-based feedstock. Again, LanzaTech is incredible. They're also helping the textile industry. They're also helping the biofuels industry. they're also helping the fragrance industry as well. So they're creating these fundamental products that are pervasive, just like petroleum products have been very pervasive. And they're doing it in a way that is circular. So very, very, very exciting for that. Excited for Logitech.
The other example that I would use is hyaluronic acid, which is very popular in skincare products, initially was extracted from rooster combs. Sometimes you read these things and you're just like, who was a
What?
person that figured this out? But scientists identified the genes, engineered the genes that produce the hyaluronic acid, engineered them into bacteria, and then optimized the process for high yields and purity. And as a result of that, you see hyaluronic acid available in all sorts of cosmetics and also in different kinds of applications. But specifically in cosmetics, you can, in your CVS or Walgreens or Sephora, and you'll see tons of products that have hyaluronic acid in it, which is supposed to be very beneficial and moisturizing for your skin. I think it's a really good example of something that people, maybe they don't use it every day. If you're someone who uses cosmetics, that could be something that is also a really good example. The other one is cheese, of course. The chymosin, which is a key enzyme in rennet, used to be isolated from the stomachs of young cows. Again, it's like, how did people figure this out? People have been making cheese since time immemorial. That particular ingredient is now engineered and produced in bacteria. So it's readily available, and every major cheese producer and probably every small cheese producer uses this engineered chymosin to make their cheeses. You mentioned collaborations between biotech startups and CPG. You specifically mentioned Lanzatech, but what are some other examples that you're excited about?
A big company bio startup collaboration that seemed very promising, and I think this is a good example to talk about, is a collaboration between Perfect Day and Unilever. It's great in theory, but this was a collaboration for Perfect Day. Perfect Day uses precision fermentation to make dairy alternatives, and they worked with Unilever's Breyers ice cream to make a new type of ice cream. And their positioning was lactose-free chocolate ice cream, and they have lactose-free written on the box. And it's just this whole messaging of lactose-free and dairy-free signals to a very small portion of the consumer market, those that are very sensitive to lactose. Although I think biologically we all are sensitive to lactose, but of course we're still eating it. But we're not buying ice cream because it's lactose-free. So this is an example of great collaboration, great companies, great vision, but the messaging was not the strongest. Could they have presented this product in a different way to say a new milk-based ice cream or something along those lines, right? I'm not trying to do a brainstorming session here, and we do have methodologies to come up with new ways of describing products. But to say something's lactose-free, to say something's dairy-free, you're automatically isolating a huge portion of the market because you're not talking about the deliciousness of it, the newness of it. Maybe hint towards the fact that maybe it is more sustainable.
All the news is teamed up to put this lactose-free ice cream. And then we tried 20 dairy-free ice creams. And here's the winner, but it's not Perfect Day.
What is it?
The winner is Jenny's, which I've never heard of.
Oh, yeah.
Which is a coconut cream-based milk. And then Oatly was number 2. And then Van Leuven was number 3. But what I did see is that Bored Cow, which also makes an ice cream, just started selling a pumpkin spice milk alternative at Target stores across the United States.
Mm-hmm.
I've had Bored Cow ice cream, and it is pretty damn good.
Oh, okay.
A long time ago, actually, very long time ago. That was Mira Sassenhaus, who's now the Tufts communications person. She was the first person to have that at the old Gen Space. That's how long ago it was.
I still think that my point of like, hey, look, don't use this is animal free or this is lactose free. Try to make messaging as widely consumer friendly as possible. Obviously being honest and celebrate the uniqueness of the product versus the fact that, okay, there's better options out there. We're just lactose free. So let's talk about the exciting part of this ice cream.
Right. Yeah, but don't forget, there is an audience. I don't know how big that audience is of people. We tested the best lactose-free ice creams. There must be a big enough audience for that.
Lactose-free is not as big enough as plain
just
vanilla.
Ice cream, period.
Just ice cream, period. Right, yeah. Because I also saw this in the world of cream cheeses. They're like, oh yeah, we're going to create dairy-free cream cheese. I actually tried it because I was at this alternative protein event, and it tastes so good. I love cream cheese. I live in Brooklyn. bagels and cream cheese everywhere. And this product was superior. It was light. It had all the flavors. It was made through fermenting lentils and chickpeas. But then to call it like dairy free, if you went to a deli and you're looking for cream cheese options, this was put by the tofu cream cheese, you would have never tried it. And then that whole beautiful innovation is just being not tried. When it comes to labeling, I mean, we should just do a whole nother episode about just
Yeah,
labels.
I think we should. I think one of the big challenges for all of this biostrategy related work is how do you drive the cost down? And it's something we've talked a lot about. And what we're seeing is, we mentioned them already, there's all these companies that are focused on biomanufacturing, and they're going to increase the efficiency. But then on the other side of it are like the companies that are engineering strains that we've talked about, that are industrializing strain engineering in a way that they will be ready to be moved into these facilities where you can produce massive quantities of these products. So I think that, like you said earlier, we're in a very exciting time.
You mentioned about costs. Are there examples of companies that meet cost targets that have reached price parity? Is it the enzyme for detergents? Any examples we could point to saying, hey, look, this was great? And I guess it depends on what type of product you're making, right? If you're making premium products, that's not a big problem. That's why K18 is so successful. They're charging a little bit of a premium price. They're going against the premium markets. And it sounds like that could be a good place to start, because low volume, high margin, it works to at least start getting infrastructure created.
Yeah.
But I think the biggest challenge is when it comes to the commodity foods and trying to get that price down. That is the holy grail. There are foods that come at a premium price too. That could be a nice entryway for companies as well. They can just say, hey, look, we're going to create a premium beef. And I did see that actually, and they had the first cultivated food tasting in Europe, and they used cultivated beef fat with a plant-based formulation, I guess, or a plant-based patty. Let's say that. It's a plant-based patty with a cultivated beef fat. And apparently it was delicious, according to the people that were at that event. That's another thing I'll add to the show notes about this first cultivated food tasting. And it doesn't have to be all or nothing, right? At least start somewhere. One small takeaway is like, let's just get started. Obviously, you can't just blow all your money and take it. It's a guessing game. There's a strategy behind it. As Karl mentioned, what is the biostrategy? You gave a great, amazing pitch to the imaginary CEO of Pepsi. That was a great pitch. But Karl, what do you think? What does the future look like?
The future is bright. I think there's a lot of exciting innovation happening. We see it. Yes, biopharma and bioindustrials have been challenged on the funding side, but the technology continues to advance exponentially. And what we're seeing across the board is just a lot of great technology being developed and products being developed that are going to be, if they're not on the market now, they're going to be on the market soon enough. Does that mean our shelves will be stocked with fully sustainable bio-based products? I think we're going to see more and more of those. I think traditional products will live alongside those for a while, but we're going to start to see ingredients that are not sustainable or produced not locally. Those are going to start to be replaced by these bio-based solutions. And everything will change. Packaging is going to change. The Capgemini report is worth looking at because it gives a lot of examples across industries of way that people are using biotech to develop biosolutions. And as our friend and friend of the pod and our client, Saveen Sahib of K18 says, biotech future-proofs. He says biotech future-proofs beauty, meaning it allows beauty companies to prepare for the future. And I think we should just broaden it, say biotech future-proofs consumer products companies.
Amazing. Amazing. So I think that's a wrap. Karl, amazing. I am so excited to just continue talking to these CPG companies, learn more about what they're doing, who they're talking to, how we could be helpful, and also to continue to talk more about it for everyone, for all of us as consumers. Who's making some of the most innovative products using biology, and how can we support them when it comes to our dollars? How do we support them? And we all have different types of incomes, but what can we do to help usher in this bioeconomy?
Absolutely. I think that's the pod.